My grandfather narrowly escaped Nazi-occupied Europe and fought in Israel's War of Independence in 1948. My father participated in the Yom Kippur War of 1973, and my brother took part in the War of Gaza in 2009, only last year, and it doesn't stop. The Lech Lecha of the Akedah is the Lech Lecha of unspoken intergenerational trauma. It is the Lech Lecha of constantly finding oneself faced against the wall and standing on the edge of the abyss. To my regret, I did not have the privilege of growing up in a Torah-literate environment of Yagdil Torah v'Yadir. I was not raised with Jewish spirituality and observant Judaism. Growing up, mine was not the Judaism of Lech Lecha el haaretz asher are'eka, lehana'atcha u'letovatcha, but rather the Akedah Judaism of constantly being on the brink of extinction. This is the Judaism of Kol ha'olam nigdeinu, the whole world is set against us. This is the type of Judaism which proclaims, just because we are paranoid, it doesn't mean that it's not true, that most of the world is indeed really out to get us. My grandfather, Shlomo Sesra, lost all of his family in Europe with the exception of one brother. And this is the Morasha Kilat Yaakov. This is the Torah, the collective heritage, which I received as a child of Tel Aviv Judaism in the 1980s and early 90s. Crudely put, I grew up in a narrative according to which the Holocaust was the Big Bang from which there emerged the great luminary, HaMaor HaGadol of the State of Israel, only 3 years thereafter. According to this narrative, the whole saga of Galut was one big, continuous, sustained Choshech Mitzrayim. The Galut as a lamentable and dark calamity. And prior to the Big Bang of the Holocaust, from which the State of Israel emerged, there were numerous other smaller bangs, smaller explosions, and an endless and relentless chain of pogroms, persecutions, and murderous hatred. I was socialized with the view that the Golah is darkness on the surface of the deep, Choshech al pnei tehom, whereas secular Zionism is the redemptive Vayehi Or. But growing up in secular Israel, nobody ever told me and my friends the other part of the story, namely that much of what we call Rabbinic Judaism was formulated in exile, including much of our canonical and sacred literature of the people, our sacred literature as a people. Nobody told us that the exile also includes the Babylonian Talmud and Rashi and Rambam and the Kabbalists of Provence, to name but a few. In fact, as an adolescent, while I was attending one of Israel's leading secular high schools, nobody taught me and my friends who Rashi was, or Rambam for that matter. My friends and I managed to successfully graduate from high school in the land of Israel and then go on to pursue advanced degrees in various universities, mostly in Hebrew and in the Jewish state, without ever physically even holding a volume of Mishnah or Talmud, without even once visually seeing what a page of Gemara even looks like. We never heard of things like Asher Yeshvei Veitecha, Aleinu L'Shabeach, Tfilat Shmona Esrei, Musaf. Growing up in secular Tel Aviv, most of my friends and I have never even heard of these terms. So when we're talking about the trauma of the Lech Lecha of the Akedah in this context, we're talking about a trauma that is so deep and so foundational that the secular Zionist establishment decided consciously and deliberately to quote-unquote spare my generation of secular Israeli Jews the so-called burden of basic Jewish literacy. This is the tragedy in the shadow of which I grew up. First and foremost, a tragedy of collective perdition in Europe and a never-ending war for mere survival in the Middle East. And secondly, this cultural tragedy, in which entire generations were deliberately and intentionally not introduced to the chief cultural and spiritual assets of our people because they're too exilic, because they're too religious, maybe even, believe it or not, too Jewish. When I moved back to Europe for college, I discovered the historical traces and remnants of Bildung Judaism, the cosmopolitan Judaism of German Jewry and my grandfather's family. It is there in Europe that I finally got it, and realized that as a secular Israeli Jew, I was by and large the cultural product of collective trauma and persecution, that much of my Jewish identity was reactive and not proactive, and chiefly anchored in the shadow of the genocide of our people. My grandfather was deported from Poland to Germany. My grandfather was deported from Germany to Poland in October of 1938 with Abram Joshua Heschel and thousands of other Jews. If I had more time, I would tell you about how my grandfather decided at the tender age of 17 that the Germans are going to work the Jews to death, and how he stood one day in September of 1939, 71 years ago, on a bridge in the city of Krakow in Poland, and bid his father and the rest of his family farewell for the last time. By then, my grandfather had had enough of pogroms and persecutions and crusades and Akedah Judaism, and he decided to make it to the Lech Lecha el Haaretz Asher Ar'eka. My grandfather, as he put it to me decades later, felt that it would be better for him to die holding a rifle in his hand in the land of Israel than to perish as a helpless Jew, betrayed by civilized humanity in the heart of uncivilized Europe. A bullet almost killed my grandfather in the 1948 war, as he was among those who tried with armored vehicles to break the Arab blockade of Jewish Jerusalem. Surely my grandfather must have realized by then that there is a Gordian knot underlying both Lech Lechas, the Lech Lecha of the Akedah and the Lech Lecha el Haaretz Asher Ar'eka, and that both these modes of Lech Lecha are intrinsically interconnected and constitute an integral part, an inseparable part of our collective existence and the destiny of the Jewish people. Both Lech Lechas are an integral part of the burden and the incalculable privilege of being a Jew. I also want to share with you that the bridge upon which my grandfather saw his father, Abraham Sessler, for the last time, this bridge was a chilling concretization of Rabbi Nachman's spiritual insight that the whole entire world is a very narrow bridge. Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tzar me'od, va'ikar haya ba'avur saviv ba'otam yamim, lo lefached klal. The whole world stood together with my Saba and my Saba Rabba that cold September day on a very narrow bridge in Krakow during those apocalyptic times. And nobody could foretell where this bridge would eventually lead and what road to take. Back then, nobody could foretell kama ya'avrun v'kama lo ya'avrun et hagesher hazeh. Nobody could foretell back then mi yichyeh u'mi yamut, mi v'mayim u'mi va'esh u'mi v'chaya natzit. Mi v'ra'av u'v'tzama u'v'magefa in the ghettos, u'mi v'chanika u'v'gaz in the concentration camps. My grandfather had some unfinished business with the Kadosh Baruch Hu in his old age. He never fasted again on Yom Kippur after the war. As Elie Wiesel puts it, one can be a Jew with God or against God, but not without. 2 years before he died, my grandfather voted for the last time in the Israeli elections. And for the first and last time in his life, he voted for Mafdal, the National Religious Party. But this was not a vote cast on geopolitical grounds. In a way, it was more of a pedagogical electoral statement. My grandfather recognized in his old age the spiritual and communal deficit of secular modernity. And this is why he voted for the closest thing that Israel had back then to a traditional modern political party. Rabbi Ibn Ezra teaches us, En mukdam v'meuchar b'Torah, and indeed much of my spiritual journey and life's work has been about working my way back from Parashat Vayera to Parashat Lech Lecha, from the Lech Lecha of the Akedah and Eretz HaMoriah to the Lech Lecha el Haaretz Asher Ar'eka, the more affirmative and life-orienting Lech Lecha. This Dvar Torah is dedicated Leilui Nishmat Rabbi Nachman Bindefeld, my grandfather's grandfather, and all the other members of our family who were murdered by the Nazis and their many collaborators throughout Europe. Eretz al techasidama. And then I'll say, Ad kan, Rabbi Hanania ben Akash Yomer. That's it.
Wow. Wow. Okay. So how did it feel delivering it?
felt very good.